Evet, şimdi gelelim bir diğer konferansımıza. Efendim yönetim, insanın var olmasıyla birlikte ortaya çıkan bir olgu değil mi? Ta eski zamanlardan beri bu şekilde ortaya çıktı. İşlerin, hayatın sürdürülebilmesi elbette ki çok önemli olduğundan tabii bununla ilgili prensipler de zamanla gelişiyor. Şimdi evrensel iş yönetimi prensipli başlıklı konferans için nereye bağlanalım? Londra'ya bağlanalım efendim. Prof.Dr. Sayın Nelson Phillips konuşmasını yapmak üzere onu Mars salonuna davet ediyorum. We are connecting to London for the conference title, Universal of Business Management Principle. I invite Prof.Dr. Nelson Phillips to give his speech. Yes.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we are
Yeah,
here.
okay. I have some slides to share, so I'm just gonna share those. Hopefully that works okay. Let's see if you can see my slides. Oops. Is that working?
Yeah, it's okay.
Great. Okay, fantastic. Well, it's a real pleasure to be with you this morning. I'm very sorry I couldn't actually be with you. I was looking forward to traveling to Istanbul and joining you in person, but of course we've all had to adapt everything because of the situation with the pandemic. Anyway, it's fantastic to join you virtually in any case. A very nice way to spend a Saturday morning, and I've been watching a bit of the goings on, and you have a really great group of people that have joined the conference, and it's a real honor to be able to come along virtually and address the group. A little bit about me. So my name is Nelson Phillips. I'm originally from Canada. That's why I sound like this. So if you're good at accents, you can tell I don't have an English accent. I'm from Canada, but I've been in the UK for about 20 years. I started out life as an engineer. So I do a lot of stuff. I still do a lot of stuff around technology, around innovation. And I'm going to talk quite a lot about that this morning. I also am on the Academy of Management Board of Governors, so I have every sympathy for what you've gone through with your conference, having to make decisions about how to have it, when to have it. We just have had, again, to make the whole decision with the Academy of Management, whether to hold it in Philadelphia next year or next summer or not. We've decided not to. We will also be running the Academy of Management again virtually. I mean, we have about 10,000 participants, so it's quite a project. My email's on this bottom of this slide. If there's anything I say today that you would like to talk about a little bit more, or that you have questions about, or that you would comments or anything, feel free to email me. I'd be very happy to hear from any of you. I'm at Imperial College in London, in South Kensington. Some of you may have been there. Yeah, I'm always happy to connect to people in Turkey, academics in Turkey. So please feel free to drop me an email if there's anything you'd like to chat about. I was given a very broad brief, so to talk about the sort of management broadly and its general applicability. And when I was thinking about what to say, I decided to talk about three things in particular, because I think they're particularly relevant today and quite interesting and quite important. And I also think they're very universal. These three questions I'm going to talk about in areas of research that I'm going to discuss, I think, are areas that are really important and really relevant for everywhere. I think every country, every market, every economy, these are relevant kinds of questions and relevant kind of areas of research, and areas where I think we don't know that much, or we don't know nearly as much as we should. And I think we're not being as helpful as management scholars as we should. So my task was to talk about the universality of management, but what I'm going to talk about is some universal questions that I think we need to do some more research in and see what you think. And maybe some of you work in these areas, and you can tell me about the research projects you're doing. You can email me and let me know. The first one I want to talk about is about innovation in crises. So I think we're in the middle of a pretty significant crisis, and these crises are really interesting because they require business and government to work together. They're led by governments. These massive crises they have to be led by governments, but there's a need for governments and companies to work together. And I think that how that works and how we should think about that and what are the principles of that are really interesting to think about. I'm going to use an old example, one you may or may not have come across before, but which is very relevant to me because I live in London, and that's something that happened in the middle 1800s, in the 1850s, 1860s, when the situation in London got to the point where something had to be done about the sewer system. So I don't know if you know, but the first large-scale sewer system aside from what the Romans did, was in London in the 1850s, and London had a major problem. And the problem was London, the population in London had increased to about 3.5 million by 1850. It was the largest city in Europe by quite some distance, and the problem of how to deal with human waste was quite a significant one. And there's a system of cesspits and people whose job it was to go around and collect things, the sewage and take it out and give it to farmers who put it on their fields. And the system was working okay until there was an innovation. And the innovation was the development of the toilet, or the water closet, as it was called at that time. And in the early sort of 1840s, 1850s, the water closet, the toilet, began to be something that first rich people and then middle-class people began to put in their houses. And thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of toilets were installed around London, but there was no sewer system to deal with the sewage that was produced by all of the water that was going through these toilets. This was caused a huge problem and led people to build pipes and build ditches and build various kinds of systems to get that sewage to the rivers. So all of the sewage from all of London began to go into the rivers, causing a huge amount of disease, and also causing a really interesting situation called the Great Stink, which is a famous moment in London's history. London had just established in 1856 Board of Works, so an organization who was responsible for kind of coordinating roads, power, sewer, gas, all that kind of stuff. And this gentleman on the right was in charge of it, Joseph Bazalgette. And what he faced was the problem in the summer of 1856. There was July, there was a period of really high temperatures in London. It was a heat wave, and the Thames was so dirty that it created incredible smells and also incredible level of disease. So as the water in the river warmed up, and the river was hardly flowing because there was so much refuse and sewage in it, and it created this moment in English history called the Great Stink. And if you've come to London, you know that the Houses of Parliament are right beside the Thames. So this was happening in the river. The parliamentarians and the Prime Minister and everyone couldn't really use the Houses of Parliament because it smelled so badly and because it was so dangerous for them. So they talked about moving the House of Parliament out of London, and instead they decided, after some convincing, that they needed to do this, which was the largest public works project in UK, in London up till that point. And the big line in the middle is the Thames, and all these little dark lines, those are all sewer systems that were being built. Those are all underground sewage systems that they decided to build for a cost of about £3 million in 1856, which of course today would be 50 billion pounds, sort of huge public works project, and also something no one had ever done before. No one had ever tried to create a sewer system at this level. Fantastic project. This guy, Joseph Bazalgette, took over, proposed that system of 1,100 miles of drains and 82 miles of big brick line sewers that we still use today, and a whole system to move all the sewage out of London out and basically put it in the sea. Now, of course, it's treated and there's all that kind of stuff, but at this point it was just big sewage drains and also big pumps to get that stuff out of London and get it out and make London healthier. Fantastically successful. After a time, by 1887, there was no further discharges of sewage into the Thames. This super large project, really interesting project, and at a time when, of course, we see exactly the same thing is happening today. A very large scale challenge, in this case also a health challenge, and very large investment by the British government into the system, and lots of innovation, because they had to figure out how to do this. No one had ever done this before, whether it was building very large scale. The biggest steam engine in the world at the time was used for one of the pumps. There was an incredible amount of engineering that needed to be invented. So this was a really interesting and very parallel example to where we are today. What did we figure out about that? Well, a couple things are really interesting from our point of view as management people. One of these is that in these cases, we do see very high levels of innovation around these large scale crises. That's an interesting one there's been some study of, but we need to have some other study of. Another big problem is around the management of these programs. So what's happening right now in London, I don't know in Turkey whether you have this problem, but in the UK, there's a huge amount of criticism of the government for the kinds of contracts that were signed for various aspects of dealing with the pandemic, that where those contracts were not properly vetted. There's all kinds of money apparently been wasted, and there's a huge uproar, and people want investigations into all of this stuff. The same thing happened at this point in 1860s. And this question of how governments and companies can work together more effectively in situations of crises is a really interesting one. So necessity is the mother of invention. Crises lead to innovation. But how do we manage these programs that require the government and companies to work closely together in an emergency footing? We really don't know that much about this, and we're not that good at it. So that's an area that needs a lot of research. Lots of other programs are like this. So this is, whether it's vaccine program right now, but also the war on cancer, climate change, which is on the horizon, all similar. And we really need to think more about how companies work closely with governments around this kind of crisis innovation. We also know lots of stuff about organizations, that they do a lot of innovation when they are in crises, and we know a bit about that. But again, there's an area where we could do a lot more research. And for individuals, people respond the same. So this question of crises innovation and how that's managed and how that works is an area where I think we could do a lot more interesting research. There's a lot of really excellent opportunities right now, especially given the situation, to study this. Second one, which I'm studying right now and I'm involved in right now, some studies on, is related to this, but a different kind of challenge around innovation, and that's the challenge of innovating and managing in situations where there's a lot of hype around a technology. So Bitcoin, if you follow Bitcoin, Bitcoin was doing extremely well over the last few weeks, went up to about $20,000 per Bitcoin, and now has fallen to about $17,000 went down by about 15% on Friday. All the questions are, what's about blockchain? Is blockchain and Bitcoin, are they real things? What's going on? There's tons of hype. And this causes huge problems for entrepreneurs and for existing companies and for governments. So we really could do with some more research on this. And I'll talk a little bit about that quickly. It turns out we're not very good at estimating the impact of technology. So when we see a new technology, when a new technology comes out, whatever it is, blockchain, AI, you pick whichever one you like, there tends to be a hype builds up around it. People get very excited about it. People get overexcited about it. Then people get very discouraged about it. And then kind of over time, it maybe proves itself and becomes a really useful technology that actually can be put into products and make money. This is the Gartner hype cycle. You may be familiar with this. It's not particularly scientific, but it's super useful, which is this idea that we get really excited about technology and then get really disappointed, and then we kind of get to some sort of sensible middle ground. But this happens again and again and again with technologies, and we see it right now with blockchain is a good example. And there's lots of great research questions around this that we should be looking at. We know some things about it, but we need, I think, to understand a lot more, especially as we increasingly are in a world characterized by startups and technology. Second story for you is one that you'll probably be more familiar with in the London sewer system, is the dot-com bubble. Some of you may have made money or lost money in this period in the early 2000s, when the NASDAQ particularly, but all around the world, this was happening to some extent. There was a great speculative interest and huge enthusiasm for internet companies, and people were willing to put tons of investment into internet companies, even if those companies didn't have even a particularly good product or even a product at all. And the bottom there, you see the NASDAQ Composite Index and what happened around 2000. So if you had $100 in there in 1999, you basically had $500 in 2000, and then you had $100 again in 2001. Lots of people lost their shirts. NASDAQ rose by 400%. This was a really interesting period. What happened? Shares in some companies were really increased at rates that were just unimaginable. So Qualcomm rose by 2,600% in 1 year, right? 12 companies rose by more than 100%. Fantastic. What was going on? What was happening? Well, really what happened is a bubble. So people became very excited. The introduction of the web, people got the idea that you couldn't lose betting on a internet company. Investment banks and other organizations fed into this and got people excited and encouraged people to do lots of deals and invest lots of money in these companies, because this was the future. And what you saw in the media is lots and lots and lots of reporting about all the amazing money that was being made, all the kinds of investments that were going on, the millionaires who were becoming billionaires, and the people with no money who were becoming millionaires. So I see all this interesting reporting in the media that encourages people and gets people very excited. And once it starts to fall, then people get really discouraged. Media starts to be really negative, and then people overcorrect and the market collapsed. And here's a gentleman with a little sign, "Will code HTML for food," a programmer who's out of work in 2000 and whatever. What do we know about this? Well, we know a little bit about this. Economists know a lot about this, but management scholars, we don't know so much about this. Economists have studied this from an economics perspective. And they know there's a very famous old book by Charles Mackay, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, very early book, and where he's first talked about this, and then many other papers trying to understand when bubbles occur from an economic perspective. Some explanations about how humans, in humans, there's a tendency to follow the crowd, so herding, so we follow the crowd, so when everyone's going in one direction, we tend to want to go along with fear of missing out, FOMO, fear of missing out, so we put our money in because everyone else is. Over optimism, we tend to be quite optimistic as a species, so it's helped us in terms of survival, but it's not very good for investment. And some cognitive biases about a lack of sensitivity to risk and an oversensitivity to upside. But what's really important, I think, is what happens to companies and to entrepreneurs from a management point of view. And what we're doing right now is a study of a company, finished a study of a company, a company who started out life as a blockchain company, but basically got trapped into that technology. They're in Switzerland. They basically started a company about 5 years ago. They became convinced that blockchain was the technology that was the best for implementing their particular business model, even though they didn't understand it very well, and even though no one really understood it very well. But that was a great way to attract capital and a great way to sort of get people excited about their company. And they were very excited about it. They jumped on this bandwagon, and then a couple of years later realized that blockchain wasn't really necessary for their company, but they couldn't then no longer be a blockchain company. They were unable to stop being a blockchain company because all of their investors had invested in blockchain. So this company, and what we're writing up right now, is a story of a company that actually failed in the end because they couldn't disassociate themselves from this technology, which everyone was so excited about, even though they didn't need it. And often you need to adopt a technology when it's early in the technology cycle to come to some understanding of how it works. So there's a lot of stuff here for both incumbent companies, but also for new ventures, especially around hype and around what happens to them when they get caught up in the excitement around a technology, and how we should be thinking about that, and tools for companies and entrepreneurs to use to evaluate whether they're in that kind of a situation. And that's what we're working on. And I think it's a really important set of questions about this hype. And given the role of technology in all of the economies of the world now, this is a really important question, this technology hypes. Economists, of course, have a different view, because they say, well, actually, they don't mind when these bubbles burst, because the bubbles that form often allow the huge amounts of investment to flow in to technologies and applications of technologies that aren't really good investments. So this woman, Carlota Perez, wrote a really interesting book, Technological Revolutions in Financial Capital, where she says that things like the railroads and the internet, and she talks about the internet bubble being required to actually create the financing to build the internet. The internet was not a viable business proposition. A hype provided the capital. Everything went broke, everything got canceled, but the internet was still there. Same with the railroads. There's huge bubbles around the railroads, especially in the United States, but also in Britain 100 years before. Everyone lost their shirt, but society ended up with a railroad system, right? So she argues, and economists argue, that these bubbles actually serve a purpose. At least some of them, speculative bubbles, serve a purpose. But from a management point of view, that's great, but that doesn't really help us with our one company or one new entrepreneur, who are the ones we care about, because actually those companies go to business and that entrepreneur fails. So from a management point of view, this may be true, but it doesn't help us very much with helping companies and entrepreneurs. In her book, she talks about some of the most important of these bubbles that created the infrastructure that then drove economic development for the next 50 years. And again, it's all at a very macro level. So this is great and really interesting, but management scholars need to move down and actually look at how can we think about this? How should companies, existing incumbent companies, and how should venture capital, entrepreneurs think about this to avoid being casualties in these bubbles? And we don't really have, this isn't really part of our conversation in entrepreneurship or in innovation in large companies. The bubbles are great. They aren't all bad from a societal perspective. But from an individual company perspective or an individual entrepreneur perspective, bubbles can be quite dangerous. Hype is quite dangerous, and we need to be better at advising entrepreneurs and incumbent companies, which means we need to have better theories. So economists are ahead of us on this one. And if you're economists, you guys are doing great, but we need to do a bit more work in management. Finally, I thought I'd put in a Canadian example since I'm Canadian. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about this company. So you may remember this company. You may have had one of these phones, BlackBerry. It still exists. Its market cap is about 3 billion right now. So if that'll be important in a minute. And it made these phones that were incredibly successful for an incredibly short period of time. And the question is, and the really interesting question for me as a Canadian is, what happened and what went wrong? What's interesting about this company, I think, is what went wrong is exactly what went right. So the thing that made them successful was those little tiny keyboards. Those little tiny keyboards got us away from having to push the buttons on our phone. And if you're younger than 30, you don't know about this, having to push the button on your phone 3 times to get a J and 2 times to get a K, and it just had a number pad on your phone. Your texting took forever. And then BlackBerry brought out this phone, which had a little tiny keyboard and started to be able to send emails and do all kinds of things in a much more functional way that required more text and more moving around the screen, and had a better screen, and it was super successful. But the problem for this company, and the really interesting thing when you look at the company, is that this company couldn't let go of that screen. Something happened in 2007, which really caused them huge problems that they never recovered from. This is their market capitalization. This is BlackBerry's market capitalization in billions of dollars. And if you look at this, this is one of the largest creations of capital and then destructions of capital in the shortest period in history. So if you're the CEO of BlackBerry, you can brag, I made more money and lost more money in a shorter time than anyone else, which is, I guess, having achieved something. He's a good guy, actually, and I know him. And this is what happened. His name is Michael Lazaridis, and this is what happened to his company. And basically, that keyboard allowed them to start really dominating in the market right around the same moment that the iPhone came out. And what happened is we moved from the old chocolate bar phones and Nokia phones with their little buttons to the keyboard on the BlackBerry, and we really loved the keyboard. The problem with this is that this company couldn't move on from the keyboard. So even though they were dominant, worth 80 billion, they just were unable to see the opportunity of making a phone without a keyboard. They insisted that people wanted a keyboard. Here's a quote, actually not from the company, but actually from an analyst. The virtual keyboard will be about as useful for tapping out emails and text messages as a rotary phone, one of the old phones, you know. Don't be surprised if a sizable contingent of iPhone buyers express some remorse at ditching their BlackBerry when they spend an extra hour each day pumping out emails. Really interesting. Even the analysts thought the iPhone's not going to work. The keyboard on your BlackBerry is perfect. Why? Because that's what they were used to, and they didn't realize how quickly people would learn to use the keyboard, the screen of the iPhone, and also later Samsung and all that, the Google phones. That kind of interface actually would work perfectly well. That Steve and also the top management team at BlackBerry were just very used to their phones, and they couldn't understand this new kind of interface. This problem is a problem of top management team cognition. So top management teams are often trapped by history, that though in this case, BlackBerry had been very successful, and that success made them unable to see that actually that they needed to change. A top management team who's been together for a while and has gone through, especially if you look at this this kind of a thing, they're really sure they're successful. They've gotten huge positive feedback from the market, huge positive feedback from users. They're completely convinced, and they've been through this together. This is only a few years. So the same people were running this company since from 2006 to 2010. It's only 4 years. And they could not see that they needed to get rid of the keyboard, to the point where I was at a meeting in Canada a couple of years ago, and it was the first meeting of a board for a research center at a university that was funded by the old CEO of BlackBerry, Michael Lazaridis. And I walked into the room, and there was about 10 people there, and there were 4 or 5 BlackBerries with the keyboards on the table. And I didn't think about the fact that this was connected to BlackBerry. And I just sort of looked around, and I thought, this is just a couple of years ago. And I was like, wow, I've never seen so many keyboards, so many BlackBerries with keyboards for years. And one of the guys clearly was unhappy with what I said. And he said, these keyboards are great. He still believed it. In 2019, that probably was. In 2019, he was still arguing that the keyboards on the BlackBerries were better, right? Still in his head, because he was an old executive from that company, it turned out, right? So if we have these people who have this cognitive lens and also this emotional attachment to features like the keyboard, then you really have as a company that's in really danger of making a really bad decision. And not maybe just one company, it can actually be in several companies, and the entire industry can be disrupted, right? This is from some great research on top management team cognition by Porak and his friends. At a cognitive level, business competition must be analyzed in terms of the mental models. So this whole way these mental models constrain strategic decision-making has a lot to do with the hypes, and also affects us in our inability to change quickly when we are in a crisis. So these things are all a bit connected together. So top management team cognition, what we need to be looking at is diversity in top management teams and creating more cognitive diversity. And it's likely a U-shaped curve. So a bit more cognitive diversity gives us a lot more flexibility, and too much cognitive diversity probably isn't bad, because if we get too high in terms of cognitive diversity, top management teams start having trouble agreeing, right? So there's some sort of U-shaped curve. We need to figure out what it is. And then the more quickly the environment is changing, then the more diversity we need, right? If we do see top management teams with very low levels of cognitive diversity, there's real danger that they're going to be disrupted, because they won't see the threat. They'll be just like BlackBerry. So what we need is better ways to understand the cognitive diversity of top management teams, better ways to measure it, and better ways to explain the link between top management team cognitive diversity and the rate at which the environment changes, right? And we always should be worried if there's been a long period of stability in the market, and we're going to expect an increase in cognitive diversity, a decrease in cognitive diversity and potential danger for the company. So these are 3 areas that I just think are interesting areas. The current situation, what's going on around us, points to areas that really deserve more attention and more thinking about. I think how we deal with crises at a societal and an organizational level, and how government and organizations, especially companies, can work together more effectively. Then the effect of hype on incumbents, and the effect of this sort of whole technology, the way this technology hype cycle works, how that affects entrepreneurs and also incumbents, needs a lot more attention. And then top management teams, and how their ability to deal with change and how that is impacted by cognitive diversity. All of these require and deserve a lot more thinking. Although we know quite a bit about each of them, there's a lot more we can figure out. Anyway, I'm out of time. Thank you all so much. I don't have any time for questions, but any questions, email them to me. I'm very happy to chat about them by email, and hopefully next year I can actually come to your conference and meet you all in person and share a tea and talk about this stuff. So thanks so much for having me, and good luck with the rest of the conference, and look forward to next year.
And thank you for your excellent presentation for Professor Dr. Nelson Phillips. And now, okay, biz Profesör Doktor Nelson Phillips'e çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Tabii ki Türkçe'ye döndük. Devam edecektik. Efendim, saatlerimiz 12:15 gösterirken şu anda değerli katılımcılarımız 12:15-14 arasında bir yemek molası vereceğiz. Sizlerin de dinlenmesini istiyoruz. Saat 14'te 1. Örgütlerin Yönetimi Uluslararası
We may have
Kongresi.
some questions. We may have a couple of questions for Professor Nelson Phillips. First of all, I would like to thank you, Professor Nelson Phillips, for joining us and having an excellent speech. I fully agree with you, what you said during your presentation, because we have to be all interested in a couple of things which are called by you problem solving or crisis and innovation. No matter what our profession is, we all have to be interested in to these things, issues. Thank you. I hope in the years to come, we are going to meet during next events traditionally.
Next year.
Traditionally,
yes, face to face, exactly.
We are going to organize. Also, I would like to thank Associate Professor Dr. Çiğdem Kaya for inviting Professor Nelson Phillips and bringing us together. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We may have questions if you have.
Okay. Now, you said low cognitive diversity in top management team causes threats not to be seen clearly. Yeah, I agree with that. But don't you think that high level of cognitive diversity in top management team causes to longer decision-making process, and isn't it as cons as well? You know.
Yeah. So I actually think there's probably ways that we can get the benefits of both if we think more cleverly about how to manage team processes in top management teams. And I think that's exactly, your question is perfect. Mustafa, yeah? That was your question?
Mustafa, yes.
Yeah. I think your question is absolutely perfect, because there's two different findings in the literature, right? One is that high levels of cognitive diversity mean they can't decide. And the other is low levels of cognitive diversity, they won't see killed. Yeah. They get killed by some change in the environment, right? So the question for us is, what's the best practices to try to get the benefits of both of those things? How do we inject enough cognitive diversity at the right time so that they can see threats, but we keep them a relatively low cognitive diversity in other times so they can make decisions quickly? How do we do both those things? And that's what we haven't done yet, is develop that theory or that framework that we can go to top management teams and teach them, this is how you need to run your board so that you can have both of these, right? And that's the question. Exactly right. You're exactly perfect. I couldn't have said it better.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And anyone to ask a question? Okay, they have no question, and thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Nelson Phillips. Evet,
thank you once more. See you during next events we are going to organize.
Is it next year that your next one is going to be, or is it going to skip a year?
We plan to organize a second one next year, I hope.
Okay, well, please invite me. I'd love to come. I missed this one.
We are going to inform you through Çiğdem Kaya.
Perfect. Well, yeah, if I possibly can, I'll definitely come, because I really like Istanbul. I really like Turkey. So I'd be very happy to come and
glad to see you in Istanbul. At
Perfect. Thank you so much.
As well.
Absolutely. Excellent. Okay. Thank you. Have a great rest of your conference.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much. Also, we are going to see you during a closing session at 6:30.
Okay.
At 7, huh? Okay.
Yeah, 7 o'clock.
At 7 o'clock.
7 o'clock.
7 o'clock? Okay.
Yes, exactly. See you at 7. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you. We are going to invite you for next one. And again, thank you. Now, değerli katılımcılarımız, dediğimiz gibi 12:15'te bir yemeğe çıkıyoruz. Saatlerimiz 12:19 şu anda. Saat 14'te tekrar burada olacağız. 1. Örgütlerin Yönetimi Uluslararası Kongresi için panellerimiz, konferanslarımız, paralel oturumlarımız tabii ki devam edecek. Yine çok önemli konu ve konuklarımızla sizlerle birlikte olacağız. Efendim, saat tam 14'te buradayız. Görüşmek dileğiyle.